Welcome to this latest installment in a series of video podcasts about the new Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists. The Encyclopedia, or ESDA as we call it, was released on July 1st. It's the Adventist Church's first online reference work. It features thousands of articles from around the world on many subjects, including biographies, articles on Adventist organizations, institutions, ministries, and the historical development of Adventist beliefs. If you haven't checked out the ESDA website yet, please do so at encyclopedia.adventist.org. That's encyclopedia.adventist.org. I'm David Trim. I'm the editor of the Encyclopedia, and with me today again is Dr. Dragoslava Santrak, my colleague who is managing editor of the Encyclopedia. And our guest today, and it's plural rather than just one guest as in many of our interviews, our guests are Dr. Lisa Diller and Kevin Burton. Both of them teach at Southern Adventist University in Collegedale, Tennessee. Dr. Diller is chair of the history department at Southern. Kevin Burton is instructor in American history there. Now, Dr. Diller has been the consultant editor for history for the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventists, and Kevin Burton serves as the ESDA coordinator for graduate students. Kevin and Lisa, thank you very much for agreeing to be with us today.
My pleasure.
A pleasure, yeah.
And to Lisa, it's welcome back, because this is our second interview with you.
There is.
Now, our first interview was shown on July 14th, available at the Adventist Church YouTube channel and on Facebook. And we had such a wonderful conversation. We didn't want to stop, but we had to, and said, well, let's do another one. And we've drawn in your colleague, both from Southern and from the Encyclopedia, Kevin. Just so people know, the role of a disciplinary consultant editor is to provide expertise, to ensure that we are at the cutting edge and that we meet certain benchmarks of good practice. And we have disciplinary consultant editors for history, for literature, the social sciences, for mission and education. And we've been very fortunate to have Lisa as our consultant editor for history. We talked about that in the previous interview. Kevin, you are joining us for the first time. Can you tell us about your role in the ESDA project?
Yeah, I was approached primarily to find more authors for the project, and specifically authors who were probably graduate students, potentially outside of our Adventist universities and colleges. Eventually, I sort of expanded that and started to draw on anyone who I thought could write well and do good research for the project. And so that happened. And that in a nutshell is what I do. It's kind of a simple role, but an important one, I think.
No, absolutely.
Yes.
We would like to have more students writing for the Encyclopedia. Why do you think it is that we haven't had as many as perhaps we'd hoped? And do you think that it is practical for students to be writing for the Encyclopedia?
It's probably the main reason we haven't had more is because of maybe not the best job of marketing on our part. We could have probably done that a little bit better from the beginning, but we've started to pick it up a little bit later. But I do think that it's a practical role. Believe it or not, this last semester that we went through, which was interrupted by COVID-19, I had assigned a project for my church history class at Southern that they write an article that could potentially be published if they did a good enough job, in this encyclopedia.
Kevin, and just to interrupt you there, so, you're the nominally coordinator for graduate students, but your students at Southern are all undergraduates, right? So
yeah, that's correct.
So one doesn't have to be a graduate student to write for the Encyclopedia. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. That's correct. And so Lisa and I both, were experimenting with this at Southern, and I assigned my students. I think there were only about 10 of them who were writing students in this class. That's how we distinguish it at Southern. Some people could take church history without writing credit, and some could take it for writing credit. And so those who took it for writing credit, I made it an assignment where they had to choose from one of the people on a list of biographies. They could choose to write on one of those people. And most of them honestly didn't do the best job. I mean, we were interrupted by COVID, and so they managed to finish their assignment. They got their grade for the course. But I had 2 students who, in spite of the coronavirus and all of the upheaval, who have submitted articles that are good articles, that are publishable articles, and that will appear within the coming months.
Fantastic.
And so, yeah, Ryan, I want to name them just so that they can get some credit here. Ryan Walker was one, and he wrote on Esther Bergman, and Dan Kattengay wrote on J.L. Tucker. So you can look forward to those articles in a few months.
That's great. Is there more capacity for that to be happening, Kevin?
Yeah, I think so. It took some effort. I mean, I did spend time going over how to do research for them, how to look for primary source documents and all of that, which I think I should do anyways as a professor.
Sure.
And so I think that was good for them, and I enjoyed the process. I had another student who was really, really gung-ho on the project and probably would have produced a publishable article if COVID hadn't happened. And so I do think that it was worth my time and effort. And for Ryan and Dan, honestly, they just took it on their own shoulders, and they carried the weight. And I didn't spend a ton of time actually mentoring them. They kind of just had a good understanding of what should be done before, and they just went for it and did a great job. And then afterwards, after I read it, then I reviewed it and I gave them suggestions and all of those things. But they turned in a first draft that was good. So
basically, if one is intelligent and moderately capable of writing, there is a place at the table in the encyclopedia.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Well, in our first interview with Dr. Diller, we spoke in length about engaging students in the ESDA project. And Kevin, I really appreciate that you shared your side of the story, and hope that through this interview, we will encourage many other teachers to mentor their students in research of Adventist history. And why not writing for the encyclopedia? I was really glad to hear about that. In our previous interview with Lisa, we promised that we would talk more about some interesting articles that she wrote. So, Lisa, you wrote several articles for the encyclopedia. What have you learned from writing about Adventist history? Would you mind mentioning some of the articles that you authored?
Sure. Some of them I'm still in process in. One that I completed was on Lillian and Orley Ford. This was a joint article on 2 people who were both worthy of having articles, and so you can look up either of their names and it'll link to the same article.
So Lisa, just say it again so everyone can hear it. The name is again
Lillian and Orley Ford.
How did you find out about Lillian Ford?
Yeah, so I put my hand up for them when I saw them on the list, and they're kind of Adventist famous for people of a certain generation because there were some books that were written about them. But Lillian Ford was my dad's great aunt. And so I had heard stories about Lillian Orley Ford from my dad's side of the family. He grew up as a kid with them coming home from the mission field, well, not coming home, actually, just coming to the United States to visit their family. Lillian and Orley Ford went in 1917 to Peru and Ecuador, and then finished out, starting in the late 30s, the rest of their life ministry in Central America. Both of them dying in Central America, Orley in the 1970s and Lillian in 1990. So they spanned most of the 20th century. And over that time, it was very fun because there are missionary stories, or there were, when I looked up books about them. There was a famous book called These Fords Still Run that was written in the 60s about them, and that a lot of people who grew up in that time period read that book. And so people of my parents' generation had read that and knew about it. Stories of their time, primarily in the Andes, although a little bit also in Central America, but it was really adventurous before World War II, that time in the Andes Mountains. And then there had been another book written for young adults around 1990, about the time Lillian died. I also found a book that Lillian Ford wrote under the title, and I'm in my own library, McKee Library at Southern. This happens when you do research and you're like, what do we have on this person here? And you check out the libraries. That's what you do first. And you try your different topic names, titles, search terms, and it's crazy what you can come up with. And here I found a book by Mrs. Orley Ford. Didn't even use her name. That our family did not know she had written in 1933. Fun fact, it was for Southern Publishing Association, and I'm also writing the article on Southern Publishing. And so it's very interesting. Southern Publishing has its own very particular kind of mission that it had. I'm learning more about that. Actually, it's funny, when you do research, everything ends up overlapping. And I'm doing a completely different project where I interviewed somebody who had worked with editors who used to be at Southern Publishing, and she had a certain view of Southern Publishing. And anyway, it's really fun when you get to start doing research and you see all these overlaps. But things that I learned about from reading Lillian's own words in her book, In the High Andes, which was clearly intended for a general audience, maybe a general Christian audience. There's nothing mentioned about Seventh-day Adventists in it, no Adventist distinctions. The Sabbath is not mentioned. She refers to Christians in it, but it seems like it was a general, it has a lot of what we might call anthropology and history and geography of the Andes and what's going on. What was the history of the Incas there? How does Mrs. Inca live? Kind of things like that, some of which we might look at today and go, oh, that's a little bit kind of condescending, but not very much, actually. She had lots of respect for the people she was studying. She had really interesting ideas about the politics that were going on. And because I'm a historian, I know about the context she's writing in the 1930s and the liberalization of these political entities. It's very clear that they were helping the Indians, the indigenous people of the Andes Mountains, the various nationalities there, in their resistance to economic oppression. Orley Ford helped some of the local people write up contracts and fight against kind of people that came in with paperwork and said, oh, we own all this land and we're trying to get rid of them all. And it wasn't. They didn't actually have a right to it. And so there was a lot of resistance against them for those reasons. Some of that had definitely made it into the popular lore about the mission stories about the Fords. But a lot of what I learned in researching them were some of their personal struggles, even their own struggles with faith, that don't make it into the mission stories all the time. I really respected, especially Lillian, through her writing, because she was the big writer of them. It might have been somebody who was paid by the conference to be the missionary, but Lillian's the one who you look up articles by, and she's does a lot of the communication and that sort of thing. It's very clear that she was very interested in becoming part of the people that she was with. They did not really consider themselves Americans anymore by the time they spent their lives in Central America, dying in El Salvador. That was home. Those were their people. And she wanted to know about these people and their politics and get to know them on their own terms. She was also very careful to name and give credit to all of the local Peruvians and Ecuadorians that they worked with, because they were the only people of European or American descent, we might say white people that were there working, very lonely, actually, in many ways. And so unlike sometimes we hear about mission stories where like the people from the U.S. kind of get all the credit, even though a lot of the local people are doing the work, I found Lillian in her writing, because it was a lot of her writing that I was reading, to be very, very important to her that she give the credit to the other people.
Yes. So Lisa, really thank you for sharing these amazing accomplishments by this wonderful woman. And at one moment you mentioned her struggles. I read somewhere that she lost 3 of her children while in the mission. She did. And that did not discourage her to abandon mission and go back to U.S. Her and her husband actually continued doing the work despite their families' tragedies and struggles. And that only tells of the strength of their conviction and the power of their motivation for the mission work. So it's a story of success, but also of struggles and challenges, and how God's grace triumphed over all these struggles.
But it's also interesting that the point that Lisa came to near the end, that for them, America was no longer a homeland.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's many Adventists today who realize of how many people that was true. The church we know today, this worldwide church, this globe-spanning church with major footprints in every continent and many countries, was created by people who went and spent decades, not just 5 or 10 years, but 20, 30, 40 years, and in some cases went back later as when they were retired as volunteers, which, Lisa, I guess would be the case with Lillian if she died there. I think you said in the 1990s, she must have gone back as a volunteer, or?
Well, she stayed. She just stayed.
I've
actually was very interested. I have not done the research I would like to do on the finances for partners, for spouses, because a lot of times they're not the official, like wives are not the official volunteers, but they are for sure just as equally a missionary and doing just as equally the amount of work. And I've been interested in sort of figuring out what the finances of that were for them. And especially somebody like Lillian, I suppose she got sustentation. It's not totally clear to me that she did. Her son was living in the area, but she stayed in the house that she and Orly had, as far as I can tell, almost up to the point of her death. And she was more than 90. She was in her mid-94, 94, I think.
So really it did become for her a strange land, her homeland.
Yeah.
And that's unusual. But what I'm always struck when I do research on these people who've spent decades abroad and then they go home to a place that if you were a missionary in the 20s, 30s, 40s, even into the early 50s, you only got leave to go home every 10 years, every 7 years if you were lucky. So you're talking at people who I'm thinking of actual cases now, the Warrens, for example, who went as missionaries to China in 1913 and went home to America at some point in the mid to late 1960s. It must have been utterly alien to them. Yeah. And there's research to be done there, actually. Yes. One of the saddest files we have in the General Conference archives is of a missionary who had gone out to Africa in 1908, comes home in 1940, and literally cannot adjust because America is so strange to him. And much of his file are these very pitiful and really rather tragic letters from him pleading to be sent back to Africa. But by then it's 1942 and it's not possible because of the war. And so that, there's a level of sacrifice there that goes beyond the obvious that we might think of, and yet a level of commitment that's extraordinary. And I appreciate, Lisa, the way you broaden it out. So often we say the missionary is just the husband, the man who goes. But most men who went, and indeed it was partly a matter of policy, they were married. So the wives went, and the children were missionaries as well. And it's good to remember that. And I appreciate you're making those points about Lillian Ford as well as
and their
husband.
Children did, at least in 2 of them anyway, also choose to be official employees of the church, really wanting to do this. And what's interesting is the skill sets required for doing kind of cross-cultural work, especially through the mid-20th century. It looked to me like, reading those kind of files, which I've not done nearly the work that you have, David, on this. It just looked like the skill set was different than some of the things that you would need back home, whatever you want to call it, back home. And that in many ways they developed into people who, in some ways, it would have been very challenging to take up kind of a traditional profession, I think, back in the United States in the 40s or 50s, after having gone and developed these whole range of skills. It did not seem like home anymore to them. I think
that's probably why you find them very often being reluctant to be finally sent home. They're wanting to stay out there, even when they're like 70. because they don't really know anything else. It's an interesting subject. Maybe a future encyclopedia article can be written on this.
Yes.
The biographies are obviously some of the most interesting articles. There are others, and Slava's going to come back to that in a moment. But biographies, because they're people, are obviously compelling. Kevin, you've also written a number of biographies for the Encyclopedia. Can you tell us about?
Sure.
One that takes your interest.
Sure. I mean, I think it's important too to remember that when we're talking about the mission of the church, that the mission also took place in the U.S. It was global as well as local. And it wasn't just ordained ministers who went out and did this. I mean, we could talk about the wives, but we could also talk about both men and women who were not ordained. And so someone that I wrote on that was compelling to me in some ways, in many ways, was Alfred Sherman Dupuy Beard, or Baird, probably is the better way to pronounce it. And
say the name again slowly, Kevin, so our viewers can take it in.
Yeah, okay. Alfred Sherman Dupuy Baird.
Baird.
Baird, B-A-I-R-D. And one of the things I found really compelling about him, his life is really defined by being an architect, and he built a lot of Adventist buildings, particularly in the Washington, D.C. area, such as the new Review and Herald buildings, the new GC buildings, the Washington Sanitarium, the campus for the Washington Training College, etc. He built all of that kind of stuff. A few of his buildings that he built for the city of Washington, D.C. still stand. But one of the things I found super compelling about him was he had a very rough childhood. And so his father was, he was an officer in the Civil War. I don't remember if he was a captain or a general or what it was. But he died when Alfred was just 4. And so Alfred effectively lived his life without having a father figure. And whenever that happened, there were several kids in the family, and his mother had to slowly liquidate all of his father's assets. And so that was, of course, very hard, but it got worse when she decided to get remarried. And you can kind of see that her remarriage was probably more like there might have been some love involved, but it seems like economics was also a factor to try to help her kids have a decent family. But he was quite abusive. And one of the things, I found this out in 2 different documents, because I was looking through and I found out that, oh my, his mom had twins on this date. And then I found some records in some courts, and I realized that the day after these twins were born, her husband severely beat his wife and locked her inside the house and refused to give her medical treatment. I mean, that's the day after she gave birth to twins. And that was a shocking thing to find in and of itself. But I think that what's important about all this is all of it impacted Baird. And you can see how it influenced his ministry, I think, later in his life. And so later he goes and he helps to start and found what they called the Christian Help Mission in Omaha, Nebraska. And the mission was literally for the oppressed, for the very lowest of the poor, and they provided free lodging to these people. They gave them clothing, they gave them food, they gave them free medical care. And I think all of this is hearkening back to Baird's early life. He knew what it was like to suffer. And so because of that, he chose to try to use his life to help people and alleviate that suffering. And that's one of the things I found really compelling about him.
Yeah, there is definitely a valuable lesson and encouragement to many people who come from difficult backgrounds. It's a story of redemption, how God can take something difficult and maybe dark and transform into someone who will actually serve and shed a light and blessings on others. And that's truly an amazing story. I loved your article on shorthand. It's not a biography. It's something completely different, but it's a very insightful article. I believe many of our viewers don't know much about this topic, but that's something that was very important back in those times. So could you please share briefly some insights from your research?
Yeah, I got into this topic because for my master's thesis, I encountered several documents that were actually written in what they called phonography or shorthand. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to read them because I could see the date that phonography uses the same numbers that we do, at least after number 3. And so I could see the date, and I realized that I needed to read them. And so I started to learn how to read them. And then I realized that it was difficult because there were so many documents that we have in Adventist archives that are in shorthand, but there's different forms of shorthand. And so I realized, wow, I can't just read all of these. I mean, there's a stack of interviews of Ellen White and probably sermons of hers that have never been read before. And I tried to look at those and I said, wow, I can't read this. And so I tried to figure out what method that was and all of these things.
And you know, Kevin, this highlights actually the need, I think, for Adventist history to be situated more firmly in wider contexts. Because the idea that sermon notes in shorthand are a great source is not actually a very new or radical one, at least to historians of other periods and places. And that's not to understate the significance of what Kevin has done here. Let me tell our viewers, because he was the first. But Adventists said sort of it never seemed to occur to us there might be shorthand sermon notes that would be good insights into people's thinking. And that's because too often Adventist history is very unto itself. It's not properly situated. So that's my professional historian input on that story you were just sharing, Kevin. But please, I interrupted you.
The early modernists and medievalists, you know, in the room are going, you don't have to take training and how to think about handwriting. The first time I did Adventist history and realized how much of it was in print, I felt like I was cheating. You know, because I was like, it's not only in print, it's digitally searchable in ways that, like, you know, in anyway. So
they bring you an original manuscript and it's typed, and it's like, I don't want the modern transcript. I want the original document. Bring me the proper document.
Yeah, well, this stuff looks closer to Arabic than it does to English, to be quite honest with you. And it is quite challenging to read. But I'm proud to know that you can do it. And the success story that I have is I did find one other person that's living on this earth who could read this form of shorthand I was trying to read. She actually didn't know how to do it, but she knew a similar system. She said, I'll take a crack at it. So she said, okay, you go first, you try it, then you send me this, and I'll try to help you out. So I got about 85% of these 6 letters that I was working on that were written by Uriah Smith. And she helped me get them to about 100%. I mean, I think there might have been one word that we didn't know, but later I found one of these letters that we actually had the original of in English in the regular script. And I was like, oh, great. I just wasted all of that time on doing this transcription work, really translation work, that I never needed to do. But then I said, well, let me go back and see how accurate we were. And there were only 4 words that were different, and all of them were synonyms. And so they didn't actually change the meaning of the letter. So I was very satisfied that we had done such good work.
So just to explain a little more why there's an article on shorthand and what the significance of shorthand is for Adventist history. So sorry to have a very long backstory. No, it's interesting. but in case people are wondering, well, why is there an article on it in the encyclopedia?
I started to, all of this led me into the history of shorthand because I actually don't know of any history of shorthand to be written. And I really wanted to know and understand the different systems that Adventists use so that we could try to read these documents that still exist. And then I started to realize this is an interesting story in and of itself. I mean, I learned, for example, that some of our ministers were speaking and preaching at the rate of about 200 words a minute. Now, that's quite fast. And if for those of you who may know a little bit about American history, that's about the same rate of speech as Billy Sunday, a renowned fundamentalist of the World War I era. And so he rattled off words like at the speed of bullets. And so some of our ministers were preaching like that. Particularly J.H. Wagner is the one I'm thinking of. And so that says a little bit about the preaching style of our ministers as well. But also it's interesting because phonography, this form of shorthand, was the first time, it was created in the 19th century, and it's the first time that we actually had the ability to write at the rate of speech. So other forms of shorthand existed, but they were simply symbols of every letter in the alphabet. But phonography cut out all silent letters and they had other shortcuts and stuff. And so you could actually write down at the rate of 200 words a minute.
Right.
But then that in of itself was interesting because it was so complicated. And so when you get to the 1890s, when we start to employ stenographers at GC sessions.
And I think this is where we, come to the interesting point for Adventist history, is that Adventists invested a tremendous amount in shorthand, and it becomes, though it's one of those things that really only a handful of experts would even realize, stenographers and shorthand, the people who take shorthand, become a significant factor on the church's payroll. And they weren't all women. In some places, they would have been almost entirely women. Actually, in the early 20th century, at least, they're often men. And every General Conference session has its own team of shorthand reporters. And because they were organized out of the predecessor of the Office of Archive, Statistics and Research, they were organized by the Statistical Secretary. We have these wonderful photographs of the shorthand reporters at every GC session up to around 1940, when the then Statistical Secretary retired. A man who, by the way, wrote a book on shorthand.
We had a few who wrote books on shorthand.
Well, he wrote the book. Well, he actually did write a book on shorthand. But this is, the church invested a lot of resources. And that, I think, is beginning to... There one can start to begin to speculate about what that says about Adventism in our desire to record and our desire to have accurate knowledge. And that's probably more than we'd have to speculate wildly about it here. But nevertheless, I think that's one reason why there should be an article on shorthand, because it was so significant a factor, as well as the reason you've given that there's so many sources that have never been explored, but also I think it says something about Adventism.
It does. And there's one other really important historical point that I could make. So one of the articles that I have pending, I'm like Lisa, I have several that are remaining to be written. And one of the ones that I'm working on is the Israel Damon trial. And for those who are familiar with that, that was a pretty significant it's a sort of a controversial moment in Adventist history because of how it involves Ellen White and other things. And some people who have been very critical of that, I think in an unjust manner, even some trained historians, they have been going through, and there's one document that we have, one major document that we have of this event, and it's printed in a newspaper. And because of the nature of this document and their lack of understanding of shorthand, historians had assumed that this was a verbatim transcript of a trial. And in my understanding, as I started to dig into the history of shorthand, I found out, that this is actually a lot more complicated. Historians had gone to the courthouses in Maine searching for these original transcripts in vain, and Jim Nix and others could never find these things. And I started to do the research, and I'm like, wow, those documents never existed because no one in courts were using shorthand to write down verbatim minutes of anything. That didn't happen until after the Civil War. And so what people were putting a lot of weight in calling something a transcript of a trial when it was literally just some farmer writing down notes in a booklet, and then they got printed in a newspaper. And so that really helps us to interpret this significant event. And I'm going to deal with that in my article on Israel Damon, which is forthcoming.
And I think it also highlights the need for us to be careful in our terminology, and indeed it highlights the need to explore these. Some people will be saying, well, shorthand, what's the possible payoff? Why should that matter? But if you haven't explored it and know the ins and outs, then precisely as you say, one can reach the conclusion that this is an actual proceedings of the court. And as you say, that doesn't exist in the United States until later. So there's as we know, once one starts to do historical research, all kinds of things emerge, including things that one wasn't necessarily looking for. We've covered some biographies. We've covered an interesting example of what people mightn't expect shorthand. We have other types of articles as well, Slava.
Yes, I remember, Lisa, you expressed an interest in articles about conferences. to some of our viewers, history of Adventist church conferences is at best vague or mostly unknown. So what can they read in articles about local conferences? Why does history of conferences matter?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think because humans, when we are really great at inventing things, we make stuff up and then we make it real. So we sometimes have identities with invented borders and boundaries, like Benedict Anderson with his, imagined communities, is kind of true of conferences too. So sometimes these conferences have rational orders, like I'm doing
natural boundaries. Yes.
Yeah. So one of the conferences I'm doing is the Mountain View Conference, which is mostly West Virginia, but also some of Maryland and not all of West Virginia. And then I'm doing the Montana Conference.
Could it be, Lisa, that you have some personal connection to West Virginia?
Sure, exactly. Yes. So Montana is actually just the state, but Mountain View, I grew up in West Virginia. That's my home conference. So I was like, sure, I'll put my hand up for that. And of course, somebody else's conference may or may not be interesting to them. And I didn't know if this would be interesting to me. We had some very strict guidelines that we had to find, just kind of go through and list out, for instance, going back in the yearbooks and just seeing where the conference presidents were. And man, you find out some interesting things. I mean, first of all, it wasn't always the Mountain View Conference. It changed names, and it was part of different unions over time, and it gets invented. So that's kind of funny when you kind of think, what was going on there?
What's the rationale?
And who started it, and why is the address for some of those early people Michigan or Ohio? So some of the conference leadership didn't actually live in the conference, or at least that's not where they were getting their mail. So that's all very interesting, and I like to dig into that. But some of the interesting things that I found was the locations, like the geographies of where some of the first meetings were. I found out one of the very first center for where Adventists came into West Virginia is about 15 miles from where my parents live. It's in as we sometimes say, the boondocks. It's way out in the middle of nowhere. There's no one that lives there now. There's no Adventists there now. But you better betcha, I'm going to West Virginia next week. I'm going to try to go down that road and find out where were these places. So the geographies of where people did things is just interesting to me to find that out. But then I also found out things like we had medical rooms. What did they call them? Kind of healthcare rooms or something around the turn of the last century, around 1900, in the town kind of that's nearest where now the conference office is located, Parkersburg, West Virginia. And I was like, I didn't know we had like a health ministry. And the very earliest, I mean, also as somebody who's been part of that conference for all of my life and knows maybe some of the traditional ways we think of ourselves in that conference, some of the very earliest executives of the conference were women. Who, were the conference secretaries, but, playing a role that was beyond just like a recording secretary in the executive team. And certainly nobody in that conference now knows that. I called them up and told some of them that have been there for a long time about this. They were like, wait, what? We had women as part of, the leadership. And then there were also physicians, especially women physicians, I found, up till about the 1970s, that almost always there would be a long-running kind of female physician that would be the health leader and promoter in terms of the executive team. So I found it very interesting and fun just to kind of look back and see what different emphases the conference had in the past, some of which were still the same up to today. I also found it interesting just looking at the rise and fall of membership over time. That just could be my interest in sort of numbers and wondering what happened here that we had 700 members and the next year we have 1,100. Is that just, record keeping?
Oh.
Did some evangelistic? So then
and very often, especially with the fall, it's because some part of the conference was taken out and put with another conference, because Adventists love to reorganize our conferences. It's almost like we're addicted to it. And so that sometimes is the explanation. If you just look at the straight trend, it seems all over the place. Yeah. And then you realize that across the history, it's not comparing like with like. Again, Montana, as you say, the state, it's kind of a natural border. Though at one point, Montana was part of a bigger Rocky Mountains conference.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
These are some of the things that that indeed emerge. Is just the very is how arbitrary, or that's how contingent these things can be.
Yes, and I think it's important because growing up in West Virginia, it's a very small conference. Some people might think 2,300 members in the conference. Is that enough people to support a conference infrastructure? There could be questions asked about if that's a good use of resources. And certainly as a child growing up, I was aware of the fact that there were questions about that. And it was an existential crisis, you know, as to like the fact that we might get divided up amongst other nearby conferences. And I can read that. I can see what's going on in some of the records about that. And that's still an issue today. Like, what makes Mountain View Mountain View? And a lot of it does have to do with its summer camp, that place that people come to for camp meeting. Place is very important for these people locally, and to have a sense that we are the mountain people. We are in Appalachia. It's the only state entirely in Appalachia. And so this kind of sense of identity of what matters. What's also interesting is to look at the diversity within Adventism. You know, very early Black churches in West Virginia, more than one might think. There are Black West Virginians, and this is something I'm starting to learn about as I learn my state's history in general. Some quite famous Black Americans that are from West Virginia originally. And then also our churches started very early being that kind of diverse. And today we have at least 2 churches that are pastored by people from our Adventist seminary in Peru in Spanish in West Virginia, because of the changes of demographics kind of in the state as well as within our church. So, I mean, things that I learned that are kind of similar over time as well as change over time. And it's exciting to kind of think about where was the emphasis, what institutions were important to this conference, helped form its identity, what are some of the stories that have been told over time as I interview older members of the conference in terms of why this conference, what makes this conference special, what they see as their own identity.
Yeah, Lisa, you definitely shared some very insightful information about the conferences, and I hope our viewers will get more excited about reading these articles. I think some of us are wondering, what were your sources? Where did you find all this kind of information? How did you go about finding information about the conferences?
Well, we have nice, if you're thinking about writing an article, we have very nice instructions over what things should be included in some of these institutional histories, just to make sure that we're kind of consistent over time. And our yearbooks, as David Trim has said, we have been pretty good at keeping records. We are a people who cared about information and keeping track of some of that. Maybe not always as much as historians would like, but certainly there's a lot to be grateful for. And these yearbooks are rich. Sometimes, again, they gave the addresses early on. I enjoyed that, like the local addresses of even the local church. So this one's meeting in the, well, not a Masonic lodge, but maybe some other Knights of Columbus lodge or the fire hall in this town. And, you know, makes the historian in me want to go try to track that down where that church was.
And sorry for interrupting you, Lisa. And the yearbooks are available online.
Yes, they're digitally searchable. And then, I mean, we have a whole lot of digitally scanned and searchable publications. So if you go to the AdventistArchives.org.
Thank you. Adventist, or actually, you can get to them from there, or go to AdventistDocuments.org. AdventistDocuments.org.
Sure.
And we also through the ESDA website, there is on the left tab, it says links. People can access all these resources through there.
Sorry, we have books that are scanned, publications.
Let me throw another one in too. Sorry to since everyone's interrupting you, Lisa.
Good.
The Adventist Digital Library, you got to go there too, because you can find a lot of stuff. And so you're talking about the yearbooks, but there's also church directories that started to be published in the 1930s. And those are a really fascinating source because they show where the Black and white churches are in our church. And they give the addresses, they give the approximate number of members. And those, I had them scan those years ago, and so they're on there.
That's great.
And also church minutes, meeting minutes, they're all available online as well.
I tracked down, I looked for stories about the beginnings and times when I knew there were kind of movements within the conference, like something changed. I would look up those years in in the Union papers, in the Adventist periodicals, which are all scanned. So I could put in West Virginia. I could put in people's names. I could search by the year, and I could find the stories that were being published during that time. But I also, of course, did some oral histories for the last 40 or 50 years in our conference anyway. There are people who are long-lived in that. And the conference office itself has some things that I have suggested they pass along to the archives, because there isn't anyone doing that in Mountain View, you know, kind of except for the secretary who's been there for 40 years at the conference office. She has kept, you know, a whole bunch of things. And so I've said, can you not, when you retire, can you not just let those go into a closet somewhere, but give us those?
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah. Thank you for helping to preserve things for the future. But also you very nicely set out for our viewers the kinds of research, the types of research that have gone into many articles. We started off by saying that students could write, all kinds of people could write, and now they might be being put off. But actually, as you and Kevin were saying, there's a huge amount that's available online. But for some topics that require more, our authors have gone and done it. And thank you, Lisa, for doing that research and also for exemplifying that and illustrating it for our viewers. We could keep on talking, but we do need to move towards a conclusion, alas. Yeah. You are both teachers, and I know you both have concerns for reaching young people. Lisa, I'll ask you first, and then Kevin, if you would follow on as well. Why does Adventist history matter to young people? Explain to people under 30 why this matters to them.
Well, I have talked a little bit about that in our previous interview, so I'll be really brief and just say that who we've been in the past and to what our heritage is allows us to build on something for the future. Maybe some things that we want to do differently, as well as ways that we can be inspired, because to think that you have to come up with every way to be good and successful and flourishing in the world is daunting. And so to know about how people have done that before is, I think, inspiring. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so for young people who want to build the kingdom of God, guess what? There have been other young people who also wanted to do it before, and you don't have to come up with all the right ways to do it all by yourself.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, from my perspective, it's similar. I think that whenever you start to do historical research, you become aware of the problems that people faced in their day. And when you become aware of the problems that people faced in their day and you see how they started to work through their solutions, you realize, you know, a lot of times this isn't quite so different than things that we face. You know, we have issues, we have problems, and we have to come up with solutions. Maybe we would do things a little bit differently. Maybe we can find inspiration from some of the things our pioneers did. And so that can be both educational and inspiring. I think all of my students learned a lot in this process, and several of them, those who put in more effort to the project that I gave them, they were just amazed that these kinds of things happened. One of my students wrote an article on Rudo the Russian. He was an NBA basketball player. Now, his article, unfortunately, wasn't good enough to make it into the Encyclopedia, but one should appear on Rudo. And he was going through and finding out all of these fascinating, and he loves sports. And he's like, my goodness, we had a former NBA player who became a Seventh-day Adventist, and he just thought that was really fascinating. And then, of course, you see that Rudo goes in and he starts to do speaking engagements in the church. And so he really embraces Adventism and tries to help grow the kingdom. And so I think there was both a sense of relevance there and also a sense of inspiring, inspiration that they got from doing these projects. I can speak personally as someone who is fairly young, in my mid-30s, who is inspired by the way our pioneers, or at least our earliest pioneers, dealt with the issues of race. And that's a big deal in America and around the world at this time. And so I think that we can find inspiration there. That doesn't mean that they were perfect in our eyes, but nevertheless, the principles upon which they're working and the things that they're advocating for were really they're really important and informative for us to this day. And so I think there's a lot of ways that we can see our pioneers being relevant. And one of the most important, I mean, our young people need to read Ellen White. Ellen White, among all of them, stands out in my mind as being so relevant. And it's not just the things that she says theologically, which are deeply moving to me personally. It's not just how she inspires me as an individual, but it's how she inspires me also socially, because Ellen White was very socially conscious. And she emphasizes time after time after time again, Adventists are to be reformers. You know, and so this is a constant need. If you're talking about relevance today, the need for us to continue on in the spirit of the Protestant Reformation, and to continue on and help people on this earth through health, through all sorts of other aspects that we've emphasized, you know, in this session here, as well as, you know, throughout our history. You know, these things are all really important, caring for the body as well as the soul. And whenever you do that, you know, you see the kingdom will grow, because people realize, they don't just want me to be like them in their beliefs, but they also care about me personally. And so I think that is very inspiring for me. I think that my students were getting glimpses and bits and pieces of that as they were working on this project. And I hope that this project, this encyclopedia, and what Lisa and I and other instructors are doing around the world, I hope that we can continue to motivate our students to say, hey, these people are long dead, but they're also fascinating, and they're instructive for us today for a variety of reasons. So dig into the past, get familiar with your heritage, and get in touch with people like Ellen White and others, because they are going to inspire you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin.
I might add to that, I know we're going on for a while too, that our church is big and broad. And I think for young people, their experience of their church may be fairly limited to just, you know, you think you know your church because you maybe grew up in it. But when you start reading about all these different people, you think, wow, there's not just one way to be a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, you know, and there's not just kind of one personality or one kind of mission or one way of talking. It's big and wide and messy and imperfect, but also fun and inspiring.
That's true.
Fun.
Lisa and Kevin, thank you very much for your inspiring words, for sharing insights from your research. We appreciate your messages very much. And indeed, you've made the Adventist history appear alive and engaging for all generations of believers. And I would say particularly the young people. One more time, thank you very much for being our guests today. This was Dr. Lisa Diller and Kevin Burton from Southern Adventist University. Please read the articles by Dr. Diller and Burton, and check the other over 2,100 articles at encyclopedia.adventist.org. See you soon with another ESDA editor and new stories from the Encyclopedia of Seventh-day Adventist online. Thank you and God's blessings.